Hello everybody, my name is Christina Rudsky from the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. This seminar is part of an occasional series about doing things differently, looking at society, politics and economics during and after the current COVID-19 crisis. Today we're looking at misinformation and conspiracy theories around COVID-19, and we have a great panel of speakers who will now introduce themselves, starting with Peter Knight.
My name is Peter Knight. I'm a professor of American Studies at Manchester, and my two research areas are the cultural studies of finance and conspiracy theories.
And next we have Vera Tolz.
I'm Vera Tolz, professor of Russian Studies at the University of Manchester, and in the last 10 years I've been involved in two large projects on the Russian media, both funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. One project looked at domestic Russian broadcasting, and the other, which is still ongoing, is looking at Russia's controversial international broadcaster, RT. And lately, my colleague Stephen Hutchings, who is also participating in this event, and I have been looking at how the Russian media cover the COVID-19 pandemic.
So Stephen.
Vera's done most of it for me, but I'm Stephen Hutchings, Professor of Russian Studies here at Manchester. I actually spent the first part of my career researching various aspects of Russian literature and culture, but for the last 20 years I've been working on contemporary Russian media, mainly television, but more latterly this work has included digital platforms. And for the past 3 years, as Vera mentioned, we've been together working on reframing Russia from Cold War to Information War, which, as Vera explained, is the first comprehensive account of RT Russia today, but it also uses that as a case study, a sort of window into the broader logics and dynamics of so-called information war between Russia and the West.
And David Scott.
Yeah, hello, my name is David Schoch. I'm a presidential fellow for social media, social networks and big data in the Department of Sociology. My research is split into two parts. On one hand, I do a lot of social network analysis, and my other research is about disinformation campaigns or political astroturfing on social media in electoral context around the world.
And finally, Michael Prentice.
Hello, my name is Michael Prentice. I'm a research fellow with the Digital Trust and Security Initiative that's part of the Digital Futures program at the University of Manchester. I'm a linguistic anthropologist by training. I did my original research on language inside corporations in South Korea, and at Manchester I'm focused on workplace security and how that's a different and new area of cybersecurity.
Thank you very much. So the coronavirus pandemic has been a breeding ground for misinformation and conspiracy theories, from where and when the virus originated to how to avoid it, diagnose it and treat it. Way back in February, the head of the World Health Organization said it was fighting an infodemic, an overabundance of information that makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance. And that's not even mentioning the conspiracy theories. So Peter, could you start by explaining exactly what a conspiracy is and how they come about?
So a conspiracy, quite simply, is a claim that everything that's happening in the world is the result of a secret and deliberate plot by evil agents. And usually conspiracy theories go against the received wisdom. They are related to other forms of misinformation, but they're often particularly sticky, particularly resistant to challenge. And they often seem to attract quite passionate, committed believers. And unlike some other kinds of misinformation, they can more easily lead to harmful behaviors and extremism and violence. So there are kind of three rules of conspiracy theories, like kind of the rules of Fight Club. First, nothing is as it seems. Second, Nothing happens by accident. And third, everything is connected. And these three things together are kind of the distinguishing characteristics of a conspiracy theory. But we also need to recognize that there are quite justified theories of real, actual conspiracy in the world. And so some of the other features that tend to characterize what we call a conspiracy theory is this idea that they are unfalsifiable, they are self-sealing or resistant to challenge through evidence. Often the problem is that any evidence that you would bring against a conspiracy theory is taken as evidence for that conspiracy. Conspiracy theories also tend to divide the world into black and white, good versus evil, us versus them, and often therefore they're engaged in forms of othering or scapegoating, finding victims who are to blame for what they see as happening. And increasingly today, we see the world divided into the people versus the evil elites. And so that's one of the distinguishing characteristics of a lot of conspiracy theories today. We can also think about why people believe in conspiracy theories. So you can kind of look at three kinds of reasons. One is kind of emotional or psychological. And here I think it's important to recognize that conspiracy theories are in some cases more like religion. They are not just a kind of a set of factual beliefs that people happen to hold. Often they are kind of complete worldviews or a sense of kind of identity and belonging, which is one of the reasons that makes them so kind of resistant to challenge. Conspiracy theories are often political. In some cases, for example, in the example of climate denialism, they are used quite instrumentally. Sometimes you can begin to doubt whether people actually believe climate denial conspiracy theories, but they are quite willing to use them to kind of further their political position. And then the third area that's worth considering is that conspiracy theories are often promoted by people with a financial vested interest. There's money to be made from those YouTube channels, or in many cases, it's not the advertising revenue as such, but it's the selling the snake oil products. So when Trump was going on about bleach as the cure, the backstory of that is where he gets a lot of his information from, of these kind of right-wing podcasts and YouTube channels. It's this this idea of the miracle mineral solution, MMS, which has been this kind of long-running fantasy cure. It's kind of silver colloidal solution. This is promoted by lots of the kind of right-wing conspiracy theorists as the solution. So those are kind of some of the basic reasons why people believe in conspiracy theories, and those are some of the main features of conspiracy theories. And later I'm happy to talk about the main COVID-19 conspiracy theories, how they've emerged and what we might do about them.
That sounds fantastic. So Vera, what types of misinformation do Russian media actors disseminate, and do they disseminate conspiracy theories?
Now let's kind of start. Let me start with a kind of very brief, maybe definition of what misinformation is. And there are, of course, academics love complicating things and debating terminology. But for the purpose of this discussion, let's say that misinformation is false or somehow inaccurate information. And I would suggest taking out the issue of intentionality out of the definition, out of the equation, because the intentionality is very difficult to prove very often. And also the question is, how much does it matter whether misinformation is spread intentionally or not in terms of its impact on users? Let's say, does it matter whether Trump believes that bleach can be used as a cure for COVID-19, it probably does not in terms of what harm such a position articulated by US president can have on citizens of his own country and other countries. There is plenty of evidence that on certain occasions, Russia in the past few years has been waging coordinated misinformation campaigns with different actors and probably the highest officials in the government being involved and certainly playing a major role. These, however, are in kind of what my research and Stephen Hutchings' research and some other scholars show. These, however, these very organized campaigns, Russia wages around very specific issues where Russia's own policy is under the international spotlight, like in relation to Ukraine, in relation to Salisbury poisoning, or where Russia wants to achieve a very specific, again, foreign policy gain, like Russia's interference, well documented in the US presidential elections. But from that, the particular journalists and kind of politicians, kind of in Western public discourse, a perception has been created that Russia wages this kind of intense, organized misinformation campaign around every single issue of importance to the world or to Western democracies. And if one would kind of stand back and think for a moment, this of course wouldn't have been possible. And again, our research suggests that on some issues which are of great importance to Western democracies, like elections into EU Parliament, Russian media actors are far less active than they were, let's say, in relation to Ukraine or the US presidential elections. And the levels of coordination are probably also very low or even non-existent. And our preliminary research suggests that in relation to COVID-19 theme, there isn't a coordinated, intense misinformation campaign emanating from Russia of the kind we saw in relation, and it's still ongoing, to Ukraine, for instance. This, however, doesn't mean that Russian media actors are currently not disseminating any misinformation or even deliberate disinformation, so intentional kind of false information. Again, our preliminary research suggests that most of misinformation currently emanating from Russia is basically manipulated information. What does it mean? It means that things which are not necessarily factually wrong are selected in a particular way and presented in order to paint a particular picture. Let's say the EU is falling apart, discontent in the EU is growing in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. But even though, as I said, most of misinformation coming out of Russia is this manipulative use, sometimes of factually correct information, completely false claims and specifically conspiracy theories are also there. In particular, conspiracy theories, most of them are disseminated by actors who are or which are clearly related to Russia, but their exact relationship to the Russian government, to the Kremlin, is very difficult to ascertain. So it's kind of hidden. Russian official state media, state-funded media, for instance, state-funded broadcasters, are considerably more careful in their coverage of the COVID-19 related topics than, let's say, they are in relation to Ukraine. And that's understandable because it's not in the interest of the Russian government to disseminate, let's say, to its public through the official media claims which might negatively impact on public health inside Russia itself. But there was, I'll give one example, an interesting and instructive story, and it shows how currently the government is treating information in relation to COVID-19. One prominent television show on the main state Russian television channel endorsed the claim that Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, is developing a vaccine and a related microchip which will allow him to control the population. And this program was broadcast and a scandal erupted so that the management of the Russian main television channel launched an investigation, and any reruns of this program, which was scheduled for the next few days, were banned. And a kind of similarly bizarre conspiracy theory in relation to Ukraine wouldn't have been banned, but would have been rerun and rerun and rerun again. So there is a difference in treatment. But again, the second most popular conspiracy theory, I think, in the Russian media actors are promoting is related again to very well-known conspiracy theory that 5G radio waves make people susceptible to COVID-19. But again, most of those have been promoted by these nebulous actors whose relationship to the state is unclear. I'll stop at that.
Thank you. And in the follow-up, Stephen, what role does the media play in disseminating misinformation in places like Russia and China?
Inevitably, some of what I say is going to repeat or at least overlap with what Vera has said, but that just shows how well we work together, I think. I should probably begin by qualifying my answer and sort of clarifying that my expertise relates to Russia, as does Vera's, rather than China, although based on other research we're aware of, there are a number of similarities between the two. I should also say that answering a question like this in full would probably require several hours, if not days. So I'm going to just restrict myself to three widely held misconceptions about Russia and its media and the role of misinformation in its information strategies, one of which Vera has already talked about in some depth. So the first point is this common assumption that the Russian media is a single homogeneous entity entirely controlled and manipulated by a puppet master in the Kremlin, which, come to think of it, is itself a kind of conspiracy theory. And that is hugely misleading. And even if we take Russian television, which is indeed sort of largely controlled and used instrumentally by the Russian state, that assumption nonetheless hides complexities that we really need to be aware of. So, for example, we need to make distinctions between outlets that broadcast to domestic audiences, Russian audiences, and that is often quite different from the content that you get in an international broadcaster like RT, which is perfectly understandable because RT, A, has to compete in a global market against Al Jazeera, CNN, BBC World Service, and secondly, as far as the UK is concerned, it's operating in an environment over which Ofcom has oversight, and that inevitably changes not just the way that it presents information, but the kind of information and misinformation that it deals in. What works in one environment, a domestic environment, will just simply not wash, will not work in another. And then I think you have to recognize that, I'm still talking about television, even in the case of television, there are certain prominent presenters, journalists, and media executives that are deliberately given quite a lot of leeway over their strategies and their activities, much more so than this idea of Kremlin as puppet master pulling all the strings allows for. And again, I think that's an important distinction that we need to make. And the relatively strict parameters within which news programs operate, so I'm still talking about television, do not apply to the same extent in, say, for example, talk shows, and even less in certain fictional drama genres. So that's television. If you move away from television, then you'll find still more kind of diversity, independence. So that is somewhat true of radio and of the printed press. When you get to the Russian-speaking internet, then you can find opinions of all colors and shades, even despite recent attempts to crack down on it. I think it's a case of the Kremlin trying to close the door after the stable door after the horse has bolted. And that leads to my second point, which is, I think it is reasonable to say that the Russian-speaking media environment is awash with misinformation of various kinds, including a lot of COVID-19 misinformation, conspiracy theories. Though, come to think of it, I'm not quite sure whether it vastly exceeds the American media environment in that respect. And this misinformation, particularly when it has a strong anti-Western focus, is little short of endemic right throughout Russian public discourse. And so it's inevitable that it will find its way onto state-sponsored television, particularly in talk show formats. That doesn't mean, however, that spreading misinformation of this sort is a deliberate and coordinated strategy. If you wanted to pursue that line of argument, then you would have to, perhaps with stretching an analogy, you would perhaps want to make similar points about the White House and Fox TV or Breitbart, for example. And then the third point, I'll sort of be brief about, because Vera has covered it quite eloquently and in depth, and that is, yes, there are undoubtedly instances in which misinformation spread by the Russian media, including RT, does seem to bear the signs of a centrally coordinated strategy. So you can actually trace narratives, conspiracy theories that occur and are presented simultaneously and in a manner that, whilst one can never prove these things, does indicate a level of manipulation and coordination. But then to deduce from those instances, and Vera cited some of them, that the Russian state is spewing out misinformation in this sort of what's often referred to very misleadingly as a fire hose of falsehood. So the idea is this fireman spewing out falsehood constantly at a constant level, day after day after day, is wholly misleading. And as Vera has illustrated, our work on COVID-19, I think, has largely put that metaphor to rest.
That's really interesting. We're going to move on to the role of social media now. Dave, what role does that play? And can you explain more about political astroturfing?
Yes. So I think that in this whole, when it a topic about misinformation, disinformation, I think social media plays a really central role in the dissemination and the sharing of misinformation. And that's largely due to how social media is organized. So social media, be that Twitter, Facebook, and now TikTok nowadays, is the first time I noticed that I'm getting old, because that goes just far beyond me, why you would do that. Anyway, so these social media platforms just provide a large kind of digital public sphere, which is very easily accessible for anybody. So there's no geographic restriction. You can access information and news worldwide, and you have an extended reach. For instance, also for your false information, you just reach a large amount of population in the world with very little effort. And then you have this kind of snowball effects, or things going viral via sharing and liking. So things spread way faster than they could spread in an offline environment. Then social media, you have less or diminished authoritative control over the information flow. So no one, I mean, platforms kind of control a little bit what is going on, but in most cases, if there is too much control, there's an outcry for, oh, they are violating freedom of speech and so forth. So they are basically have to allow certain kinds of things still to be on this platform. Now, if you compare this to old media, they are largely kind of, it's not as easy to share false information because they are kind of, there's an authoritative control behind it. So this is, everyone has access to everything, but it's also that now actors that before the internet or before social media, who couldn't really influence and public opinion, it's now easy also to have a kind of a bottom up influence about in opinions, right? So you can share anybody can share mis or disinformation. It doesn't have to be any authoritative forces. And this means also that it's possible kind of to shape public opinions according to an agenda that might be perceived as something that is underrepresented, ostracized, or marginalized in mainstream news media. So no one would, or news medias might only talk about this 5G in a kind of old conspiracy theory way, but online people find information that they might reinforce their sentiment against 5G. When it comes to, so my research is when it comes to disinformation, mostly connected to electoral context. So when disinformation is spread during election campaigns. But before I go into that, it sounds, when you talk about the properties of social media, it sounds like, oh, that social media is basically made for this kind of easy dissemination of disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, and so forth. But if you go back like a decade or so, social media was celebrated as kind of it's breaking the oligopoly of state-owned mainstream media. It's a liberating technology because now there's more freedom for people, and this is mostly always connected somehow with the Arab Spring and the revolutions that were going on there. They are always attributed a bit too much to, like, sometimes called Twitter revolution, which is a bit too strong. I mean, social media definitely helped in these kind of uprisings, but they were not central to that. So, but you have this, so this is what is called basically grassroots movements. And you have a bottom-up collective action on a local level. People organize themselves on social media to reach a goal on the state level. Now, this kind of works. That's what maybe state actors might seem. And they try to, oh, can we fabricate this? So can we do such a grassroots movement that seems to be bottom up by normal citizens? So it appears to be a genuine grassroots movement, but it is orchestrated in the back, top down by state actors. And this is what is called political astroturfing. Where does the name come from? It's just because these disinformation campaigns are basically fake grassroots movements, and astroturf is a brand for artificial turf. So that's where the name astroturfing comes from, as a fake grassroots movement. And the goal is the same as the goal is the same as for genuine grassroots movements. It just maybe in a more negative way. They want to influence public opinion and steer public opinion in certain direction. And I guess the most, what all people have heard about, and it was already mentioned before, the Russian bots in the US election in 2016. I think since then, at least everyone has heard about it, but this has been going on for years before that. So I've been studying with some colleagues a case in 2012 in South Korea during the presidential election where this was already going on. And yeah, you can even argue some during the Obama legislation in 2008 or so that there were things going on already. What are they trying to do? So people always think, oh, that it's obvious. We are trying to discredit other opinions of the other side and causing distrust in authorities, and we try to promote our candidate in these campaigns. But it's more often, if you look at what they're doing, it's more like, actually, it seems like they don't even have any real strategy, but just trying to produce or sow chaos. You know, so they're trying to widening already existing divides between, say, left and right. So if you look at the US election, for instance, you see activity from these Russian bots in under the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So trying to promote or going against racism, but also having really racist posts. So really going left and right to try to divide the public even more. But it is necessary, it's important to note that this is not only a Russian thing. So this is going on everywhere, basically. So we are at the moment studying 20 cases where this disruption happened throughout the world. So South America, Africa, Europe, so everywhere. This is not something that only originates from Russia. Second misconception with this is that this is all bots that are working. So everything is automated, and this is also not true. And there's a huge human component behind this. And just so the funny anecdote from our research is always when we look at the activity level, when these accounts are active throughout the day is usually, or it's very often between 9 and 5, so normal office hours. And there's actually a dip at 12 o'clock. So they have a lunch break in their activity. So that was a really, really funny result of our research.
That's really, really interesting. And going on to language, Michael, how do anthropologists study fact and fiction cross-culturally?
Sure. So anthropologists, or in my field, linguistic anthropologists, would look at issues around conspiracy theories and also the flip side around truthful information, using a term we call language ideology, or sometimes called linguistic ideology. And when we look cross-culturally, we say, well, what do different languages or different language culture groups think about what the truth is, and how that is expressed linguistically? So we can think of that clearly when we go to a court of law or we go to bureaucracy and we realize that documents, for example, have more power than spoken words, even if they might have the same referential or linguistic content. In places that are, where you have large institutions like legal systems or scientific institutions, we see oftentimes a heavy bias towards things like documents, scientific language that's been separated from the people speaking. However, in lots of places, you do see that oral narratives can be very strong tellers of the truth. Even in religious contexts, we see confessions. But even now, what's interesting is with the rise of social media and other forms of participatory media, that you see certain ideologies saying that you can have truths that emerge in the comments on a YouTube page or in a tweet, and for a lot of people, those can seem to be more truthful than, say, official information that might come from a scientific body or a government body. And so what these point to is that, if we look at, while there are a lot of similarities, we can look at different language and cultural communities or nations and say, well, what kind of media are seen as more truthful or more fact-bearing, and what are perhaps more suspicious? And those might have a relationship to each other. In Korea, for example, what's been interesting is that while the Korean government has received a lot of positive press, certainly from the international media, at the outbreak of the COVID crisis in late February and early March, actually there's quite a lot of disinformation or perhaps misinformation circulating on different internet cafes or internet forums that are private groups. So one common variety is mom cafes, where mothers might share information about their children, and those actually became quite a big source of kind of small scale conspiracies. So what hospitals or what apartment buildings were early breakouts. And because that information was coming through these private organizations or private communication channels, to a lot of people, those seem like more authoritative. And I think we can all recognize that, you know, if we get information from a family member or a close friend or a person we think who, you know, knows what's going on, we might tend to believe that more than we believe that same piece of information if it came on, you know, the BBC News. So all these things point to the fact that, you know, while we can think of cross-culturally, you know, somewhere in Samoa or somewhere in Australia or Russia might have different ideas about what fact and fiction are, that actually what we can look at instead is the way that people do kind of detective work for themselves. So linguists have a term called epistemic markers, and so those are bearers of the truth. So a clear tone and no hesitation is a very common epistemic marker for things like the truth in English and lots of other languages. Other kinds of languages have different kinds of epistemic markers, but we also use epistemic markers, say, when we read the news. Does the news, or we go on a web page, does the news or web page look authentic? Does it look legitimate? And to bear on some of the things that David and others have talked about, you know, when we see media that actually looks quite authentic, or it has all the epistemic markers that we're used to, it can be very unsettling, or it can trick us very easily because it looks quite authentic and authoritative, because it has a lot of the other linguistic or aesthetic features that we're used to when we find the truth. And so that's why you can start to see periods when different kinds of, you know, if a certain kind of media or platform starts to become inauthentic, just like, you know, people turning on Facebook, then you can see a rise in other media, that becomes more truthful. So now TikTok might become more truthful, partly in relation to that we can't trust the epistemic markers of things like Facebook or the BBC anymore. And so each of those scenarios is quite different, obviously, in every country. One thing I wanted to mention about South Korea actually is you have a different, you do have a phenomenon around this kind of small scale conspiracy theories. Won't get into North Korea for the moment, but you also see the other side, which is kind of what we could think about as hyper truthfulness, which is on the side of the government. So when I wrote about this for the Policy at Manchester blog, and the Korean government has been praised for its transparency, but a lot of the news reports in Korea point to the way that actually there's this abundance of information, this kind of almost a fire hose, to use Stephen's metaphor, of actual truthful medical information that comes through all these different channels. And actually a lot of people have reported that it's overwhelming and they can't even really read or comprehend it, and they become quite fatigued by all this information, which at the end of the day is truthful. They're truthful reports about COVID outbreaks or infected persons in certain areas. But you do have negative effects from this kind of hyper truthfulness, is what I've come to think about it. So you do see very interesting phenomena both on the conspiracy end side, where, you know, the truth markers are being muddled or confused, but we can also look to the other side, which is, well, what does truthful information really look like, and what's the appropriate amount of truthful information?
That's fascinating, thank you. So, Stephen, how does propaganda turn into misinformation?
Well, I think there are probably two separate answers to this question, and one is probably more straightforward than the other. Beginning with the straightforward one, I guess you could say misinformation turns into propaganda when it's adopted by a state or a political party or some other political actor and used for a particular ideological or strategic purpose. And you don't actually have to look as far as Russia to find examples of that, although one obvious one from that domain would be various absurd conspiracy theories circulating on the Russophone internet about the downing of the Malaysian aircraft MH17. The idea that it was the Ukrainians who shot it down, one end of the spectrum of absurdity, the other that it was actually a ghost plane full of dead bodies that were already killed before the plane was shot down. And these were clearly picked up and used by Russian state media outlets, including RT for that matter, to distract global attention from accusations that Russian-sponsored forces were to blame for the disaster. But, you know, a little bit closer to home, you could argue that, you know, that they've, to use an example that we're all sort of acutely familiar with, the Leave campaign's infamous NHS £350 million a week claim. And, you know, I won't even go down the path of Donald Trump and his attempts to get himself, increasingly desperate attempts to get himself re-elected. So, you know, those are all contexts in which misleading information is adopted by a political actor for a particular strategic or political purpose, and then you can begin to think of it as propaganda. But the second, much less straightforward answer, and we've actually already covered some of this ground, is to you know, to remember the high degree of confusion, uncertainty about the precise difference between misinformation and propaganda, and indeed all these related terms. And there isn't really a consensus on this out there. And as we've already sort of discussed, distinguishing misinformation from disinformation, malinformation, fake news, propaganda, it's a slippery business. You can establish typologies, and there are many typologies out there, but as is often the case with typologies, as soon as you look at specific examples, the categories begin to break down, and that's no more true than in the case of the terrain we're talking about. As we've heard, or as we've already agreed, the role of intent is important, and is often referred to when separating misinformation, which is better thought of as a generic term to describe the circulation of information that's inaccurate or misleading, from disinformation, when misleading information is knowingly disseminated for the explicit purpose of deception. But identifying intent is always difficult, and in many cases it's impossible. I mean, when you're talking about the Russian state, it's become particularly adept in the new digital environment at covering its tracks. And that's the case with bots and trolls, and let alone these kind of various proxy websites that mask themselves as something other than what they are, but actually proving and tracing a link back to the Kremlin is well nigh impossible. And secondly, one person's idea of misinformation as presenting something in a highly selective and biased way, and that I'm quoting from one of these typologies that includes distorting context of an event or framing it in a highly selective and biased way. That appears in one person's typology under misinformation, but in other typologies that counts as propaganda. And who is to decide when context has been distorted, and what can one ever agree on what the true context of an event actually is? So again, to give a slightly old example from our area, the annexation of Crimea and those notorious little green men, who we all know were really Russian soldiers in disguise. Now, if you draw a context which is that of a kind of imperial power looking to expand its influence and grabbing the territory of its near neighbor in a naked power grab, which it then lies about in order to deceive a global audience. That's one context. You know, you can also draw a context, and this is just not necessarily one that I endorse, but it is one that of increasing American and particularly US influence on the whole of post-Soviet space, an attempt to move the borders of NATO as closer and closer to the Russian border and so on. Then that act of annexing Korea and the idea of covering it in a falsehood that no one in the Russian readership will doubt is a falsehood, but will justify it as a, and sort of I found what was said earlier quite useful. What is a lie in one context is not necessarily treated as a lie in another. So changing of context leads to completely different interpretations, and these typologies very, very quickly break down. If you take the very narrowest term, disinformation, as the deliberate dissemination of factually incorrect information, then that's a fairly tight definition, but it becomes actually quite difficult to assign much activity confidently to that category. Whereas if we work with broader terms like misinformation or propaganda, we can end up in a quagmire of overlapping and interrelated terms in which you end up having to include everything from the Daily Mail, or even the Guardian for that matter, all the way to far-right conspiracists like David Icke. So there are problems with adopting a narrow definitions of these terms, and there are a whole new set of problems involved when you take the broader and more generous definitions. And I think I'm going to make a plug for humanities here. I think that's one reason why the really careful, reflexive and context-specific approach to meaning that we in the humanities take is really valuable in this area of research. So those years I spent studying literature were not completely in vain.
David, can you tell me what's the danger of misinformation around COVID-19, do you think?
Yes, so I don't think I'm going to be able to give a comprehensive answer to that question, but at least I try a bit to connect it to what's going on social media and also contrast it to the political aspect. So when we are looking at this or misinformation in political context, and now we always have, oh, there's this and that much amount of disinformation going on online, blah, 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 but it's really hard to measure an actual impact on people offline. So how are people actually getting influenced by that? So in the political context, for instance, there's little to no evidence that disinformation is able to steer public opinion in certain directions on a large scale. Because in most cases, it's also hard to measure the offline impact. Now you have you can count likes on Facebook or on Twitter for certain posts that disseminate disinformation, but did these people like or share because they oh yeah, I'm convinced now, I like this, or did they already believe in this, or do they just share it for mocking it or whatever? So it's really unclear why people share and how, if people get influenced or not. Now going to misinformation on surrounding the pandemic, I think that is a bit more dangerous actually than the political disinformation. We've talked about this already before, but for instance, if there are these questionable health advices like drinking bleach or so, and this has serious actual consequences for people's health, and there were a lot of people actually doing that, and some people died actually because of that. So these are a far greater danger than this political disinformation. Second, what is interesting on this is based on a study that was around the measles outbreak 2019 in the US, was that these kind of disinformation campaigning around these health issues bring more people towards the anti-vax movement. So the study was comparing anti-vax Facebook groups and pro-vax Facebook groups and undecided Facebook users or groups that were kind of neutral in this. And what was observed that during that time of the measles outbreak was that these groups, the anti-vax groups, gained far more new followers than did pro-vax groups. And also a lot of undecided people moved into these anti-vax Facebook groups. So you have this effect that people now suddenly start, which is kind of weird, starting to mistrust vaccinations more. Probably because of the misinformation that is surrounding it. And second or third point is that these misinformations around COVID are used in trying to politicize the pandemic. So for instance, blaming certain ethnic groups for the outbreak, going against, or I think we have already observed in certain parts an increase in racism against the Asian population, or also parts against people of color and so forth. So I think these are certainly not all the dangers, but at least the dangers that I think are there when it comes to misinformation around COVID.
Maybe I could come in there and add, in addition to the kind of quite straightforward examples where misinformation and conspiracy theories are leading to direct harm, like the arson attacks on 5G, or the likelihood not to vaccinate, or the rise in kind of anti-Semitic and other forms of racist hate crimes. I think one of the perhaps more long-term and possibly more damaging aspects of the rise of the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories on social media is the increasing distrust of experts and the increasing distrust of the very ground rules of science and objectivity. That those things are kind of hard to measure, but they might actually be kind of, in the long term, the most harmful consequences of this spread of social media, of kind of misinformation on social media.
Well, then to wrap it up, what are, Peter, the biggest conspiracy theories around COVID-19? And is there anything that can be done to sort of combat those?
Okay, I'll give you the kind of, quick version of the conspiracy theories that are out there. We've mentioned some already. The first ones to emerge, and this is coming from a project I'm doing with some data scientists in Amsterdam. We are tracking vast amounts of social media. So the first ones that emerged were to do with the idea that the threat of COVID-19 was exaggerated, or it was a hoax. Trump himself was pushing that idea. About 40% of Americans have said that they believe that the threat is exaggerated. Then you get the idea that there is a deep state plot against Trump, and that the whole pandemic is part of that kind of deep state plot. And that taps into kind of other long-running conspiracy theories about QAnon and this coming storm of a kind of, a civil war. Then you get the idea, believed by about 30% of both Americans and French, and I also think Germans, a recent opinion poll, is the idea that the virus was released from a lab, either accidentally or deliberately as part of a biowarfare campaign. And that comes in several versions. One version says the Chinese are to blame, and another version inevitably says the Americans are to blame. Then you get the idea that the pandemic is part of a plot by global elites, either George Soros or Bill Gates, to bring about the control of citizens around the world, perhaps with the idea of depopulation. And this theory is often tied into anti-Semitism and other kind of forms of right-wing extremism. Then you get the kind of the 5G conspiracy theories, lots of different mutations there, but they seem to suggest that the virus is directly caused by 5G radiation, or that the pandemic is being used as a smokescreen to allow the rollout of the installation of 5G. And that's actually now kind of the most popular conspiracy theory on social media, because it's joined in with anti-vaccination conspiracy theories suggesting that 5G might be involved in this kind of large plot to introduce compulsory vaccination around the world as part of some kind of vast plot by big pharma. Once again, there are kind of different versions, different variations. So what can we do about these conspiracy theories? You know, there are things that researchers have shown work more than others. And a research project I've been engaged in over the last 4 years with a large number of European researchers, we put together a list of recommendations of how to combat conspiracy theories. The first piece of advice is choose your battles. Die-hard, kind of committed conspiracy theorists are by their very nature virtually impossible to convince otherwise. So what you're looking at is kind of the vast majority of people who are somehow in the middle ground, not entirely convinced of the conspiracy theory, but attracted to it. And there you can use techniques, what's called sometimes inoculation, to draw on a kind of viral metaphor, or pre-bunking as opposed to debunking. If you get accurate information out there first, before people come across the conspiracy theory, they're more likely to be receptive to debunking. Whereas if they come across the conspiracy theory first, they tend not to believe any debunking. You can also use conspiracy theorists' own obsessive skepticism back against their own views. So you say to them, well, look, you know, you tend to distrust everything you read. So why is it that you're willing to believe someone like David Icke? Where's the vested interest, the financial kind of value of someone like Alex Jones? So you can get their skepticism recruited as to be to scrutinize their own theories. But probably more than anything, and this is what we're beginning to realize is a game changer with COVID-19, is the role that social media platforms themselves have in being responsible about information that is put out on their platforms. So in the last couple of years, Facebook, for example, after the 2016 US elections and the whole scandal around there, and with the Vote Leave campaign, Facebook began to clean up its act, and there was, you know, some signs that that had some traction. A year or so ago, there was a series of both academic and journalist exposés of the radicalization process of YouTube, the way that its recommendation algorithm tends to lead people down the rabbit hole towards more extreme views. There are kind of, you know, there are debates of how true that is, but YouTube, in response to that, changed its algorithm, and in the last year or so, it's made it less likely that you'll get recommended more and more extreme conspiracy theories. But with COVID-19, we've noticed that nearly all social media platforms have gone far further than they ever have before in, first of all, putting out, making it much easier to get accurate scientific information. So Google has done good work on that. Also, Facebook have done the same. But they've done a lot more to deplatform and to marginalize conspiracy theory information in a way that even only a year ago, it would have been unthinkable. But now, because they've recognized that some conspiracy theories and other forms of misinformation lead to direct harm, that they've now recognized that they do have a role as a responsibility in the way that publishers and other kind of regulated media outlets have traditionally had.
Well, can I say thank you to all of you for a really interesting discussion about this topic. I thank you all for taking some time out of your day. And if you have any questions about this issue, we'll post this on social media and you can let us know, and we'll ask our range of really, really amazing academics to find out more information. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.